Nihilistic. We kind of have established introduction there. The stream was cut there, so we're back on again. If you guys are there, thanks be to God. So Father Jeff had just given pretty much an introduction there on the pastoral letter of the Canadian bishops, talking about social media and how the church needs to take a role in that and how we're involved in that. Kind of taking out the examples of misinformation, fake news, the consumption of it as well, kind of even the dehumanizing element of the whole thing. So that was kind of a basis to kind of springboard into some of the stuff we're living today. Father Jeff, you were describing, or you described Plato's cave kind of as an image of how we're living here, kind of like an oligarchy, kind of disguised as a democracy. Maybe if you can kind of just say what that is too for people who wouldn't be familiar with the terms. And yeah. So look, we're back on hopefully will be a clean stream.
Great. Well, yeah. So I think the point was that when you understand the cave of Plato put in the context of some of these questions that were put at the beginning of the Republic, what you're starting to see is that Plato is he's a critic. He's a critic of those who are using, in the context of what we're talking about here of social media. Plato would be a critic of those who are using social media for nefarious purposes, right? Like, for example, one of the purposes of social media is to create identity groups that are warring with each other, right? So that they don't ask the question of, well, what is the truth, and what does the common good require of us, or what would justice require of us in this situation? Instead, if I'm just part of a group and I'm getting angry and defending my interest, well, then I'm not gonna ask these bigger questions. And I mean, Plato also understood, and he was critical of the Sophists, right? The Sophists were those advisors of the let's say the politicians of the ancient world who didn't believe that there was a truth. They didn't believe that there was a God, that there was truth, that there was the common good, that there was justice. And so they thought that in order to maintain a government, the government either, in the case of the Greek world, right, the government either had to become an empire, or the world would dissolve, or the nation, let's say, would dissolve into competing groups that are always warring against each other. And the principle of behavior for the Sophists was not justice, because they didn't think that there was justice or truth. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche hated Socrates. Right? He said Socrates is my great enemy because Socrates convinced Western man that he has an interest in pursuing the truth, right? That the truth matters for how we live our lives. And the Sophists of the ancient world, what did they start doing? They started developing mechanisms because basically they argued that human beings they didn't think that human beings had any dignity, right? The Canadian bishops are saying, we have to understand that everybody has dignity, right? So the Sophists of the ancient world, they had no conception of human dignity. They just thought that humans were a bundle of perceptions and passions. And so the whole goal of organizing political life or social media was, well, how do you influence the people's perceptions to manipulate their passions in a way that's to the advantage of you, the powerful, right? And so they came up with their scheme of building an empire. Well, how do you build an empire? Well, you build an empire, by the way, if anybody wants to read about this, I highly recommend Werner Jaeger. He was a Harvard professor. I visited his tomb last year. He's buried in a cemetery here in Cambridge. But Werner Jaeger wrote this wonderful, it's a 3-volume work called Paideia. But volume 3, the first 120 pages of volume 3, deal with this conflict between Socrates and Plato and Aristotle on the one hand, and the Sophists on the other hand. And the Sophists basically came up with, they were probably the first in what we would call the Western world, to come up with the idea of an empire, right? Well, what are some of the features of an empire? Well, you're all united against a common enemy that you all fear. In the case of the Sophists of the ancient world, they thought, well, we should fear the Persians, right? The threat of we fought a war against the Persians because there was a time where they were probably going to try to take over at least big chunks of the Greek world. So they're a convenient historical enemy. And then what do? You create images in the minds of people to convince them that the Greek world is in a death match with the Persian world, and that one side or the other has to prevail. One side will be free, the other side will be enslaved. And then, well, also to basically, you don't want people to think too much, so you have to develop forms of entertainment, sports, other forms of entertainment that will keep the people satisfied and basically keep the people attached to their passions more than anything else, especially for times when you're not fighting in an open war with your enemy. And then you also have to come up with a kind of rationale. And the Sophists said, well, even though we don't believe in the gods, we should come up with like a religious rationale for why we're in this war with the Persians. And the rationale that the Sophists came up with was, well, it must be that God gave us the most beautiful language there is, the Greek language. And so also God gave us free institutions. He gave us democracies. Now, again, I think we need to say something maybe after this about whether they were really democracies or not. But God gave us free institutions. And so the gods, they must want this beautiful language and these free institutions, right, to be exported throughout the entire world. And God also gave us a navy, right? And this navy is the most powerful and the most sophisticated from a technological standpoint navy in the world. I always think it's interesting to look at these Greek triremes. And I'm sure in their time they were wonderful. They were wonderful technological advances. But the difference between a trireme and a modern warship, or the difference between a spear and a modern missile is incredible. But with these basic elements, the ones that I just outlined, I mean, there's much. We can basically say that, well, the parameters of how there could be what's now called collusion between entertainment, between media and government, right? That's designed to provide misinformation. The parameters for that are already laid out in these ancient debates between Socrates on the one hand and the sophist on the other hand. So I think once you understand these parameters, and then you kind of go to the modern context, what you see is that, well, in the modern context, we're dealing with a more sophisticated technological developments. So one of the articles I sent to you is this article how, well, the Air Force now is doing research, right? How can you use social media to control people like drones? And maybe based on our experience that just happened, how do you drone social media events, right? No, but I mean, the whole point of this research is to say that, and it's something we alluded to earlier when we were speaking about this court case in which evidence is coming out that the social media companies know, right? They know that a child who looks for so many hours a day on the screen at certain events, that their brain is going to be rewired. And if their brain is going to be rewired, well, this research that's being done suggests that, well, not only do we know your brain is going to be rewired, but also we know what mechanisms to use that will condition how you think, how you approach events, what you take seriously, what you don't take seriously. What's, in other words, going back to that ancient dictum that Socrates came up with. We know that truth is the opinion of the powerful. And the Sophists understood that, or they thought of themselves as the powerful, right? The ones who would sit back in their clubs or maybe in the terminology that we're using here, that they would sit back in their clubs and they would create disinformation, right? But in this case, in the case of the Missouri versus Biden, in the case of this other Children Health Defense Fund case, it's not people sitting back in their clubs and creating disinformation, right? It's actually the government and the clubs colluding to create disinformation for whatever are the purposes of the empire. And that's also why I sent, so in this context, right, I thought, well, also in the ancient world, as I was pointing out earlier, that, right, also in the ancient world, when Glaucon and Adeimantus, when they say to Socrates, well, maybe we should just set up our own clubs in the background and use those to determine what the truth is and what justice is. Again, this is also described in Werner Jaeger's Paideia, and it's also described in Aristotle's Politics. It's also described in Aquinas' commentary on Aristotle's Politics, that, well, one of the dangers you always have and by the way, this is also a concern of Catholic social teaching, right? There's that part of Catholic social teaching that says, well, probably in the modern world, democracy is the preferred form of government. Everybody, I think when we see these challenges to democracy, right? For example, it's much more the case if you do a survey of bishops' conferences around the world, right? It's much more the case that in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, right, you'll see bishops who are much more daring in commenting on, for example, the quality of elections. And it's funny how, well, and again, I think I sent some articles around on this, but but a Catholic social teaching says, well, yeah, well, if democracy is the preferred form of government, if it seems like that's the case, well, what are the requirements of justice in a democracy? And of course, one of the things that democratic theorists for centuries have pointed out is that, well, one of the essential requirements of a democracy is that there be a robust public discourse, but that it be rooted in seeking the truth, right? That it not be just manipulation of perceptions, that it truly be rooted in seeking the truth, so that there can be an informed debate about, well, what is just or unjust in this situation? What are the principles that govern human nature, that govern a society? And how can those principles be put into effect, right? So often in politics, what ends up happening, I think especially more and more in Europe, is that, well, the Europeans are basically colonies, or they act like colonies of the American empire. And so the leaders that are in place, they're there more to assure that, well, whatever Washington, in other words, whatever the powerful want, the powerful will get, right? And we'll manipulate perceptions in order to enable the powerful to get what the powerful want, whatever that might mean for whatever little country is out there. And in the ancient world, Plato and Aristotle both developed this understanding that, well, you know, probably the biggest threat ultimately to democracy is oligarchy, right? The biggest, and so there's, and probably the biggest threat to democracy, right, is a government where it looks like a democracy. On paper, it looks like a democracy, but in reality, it is an oligarchy, right? And that's where over the Christmas break, I was reading this book, which it's I guess you could say it's like a social science analysis of oligarchy. And one of the things that this book is called, the author is Jeffrey Winters. The book is Oligarchy. What I find interesting about this book is that he looks at oligarchy as a phenomenon both across time and space. So ancient, modern, East, West, developing world, undeveloped world, supposedly, if you want to use those categories. And he points out that there are common features to oligarchy across time and space. And then within those common features, there are some distinctions, right? So if there's a common feature to all oligarchies, is that the social and political institutions in all oligarchies are set up to defend the wealth and the property of the rich few, right? And so there's all sorts of ways that could be done. And he makes this distinction. He says, well, there are some oligarchies where the oligarchs are like they're part of, I mean, in other words, for example, in Florence, there was a council of 10 oligarchs, and they exercised all power, right? So in other words, the legal structures, the constitutional structures were basically just set up to enable the oligarchs to rule. There could be other situations which are very unstable, where there's really no clear governing structure for the oligarchs, but the oligarchs are the most powerful. In fact, they might even have their own armies. And so the oligarchs, they're always warring against each other, and there's no real one oligarch that ever like gains control of the government. And Winters points out that this was Russia right after the Soviet Union in the 1990s, that it was essentially warring oligarchs. He also points out that many medieval societies, this was their actual nature, right? They were, once the Roman Empire falls apart, essentially feudalism is basically various wealthy people have their own armies and their own land. They have, in other words, they have their wealth and their property, and there's no nation or rule that develops that takes away power from them. There's another kind of oligarchy, which is the oligarchy where one oligarch among the many that are competing for power, one oligarch emerges, and he kind of like stabilizes the system. And again, Jeffrey Winters points out that this would be like Indonesia under Suharto, who ruled as, people would say he was a strong man, but basically he was an oligarch who rose from the major oligarchic groups. And from within, he was able basically to keep everybody balanced, keep all the different oligarchic families balanced. And actually, there can be cases where from this one man that kind of stabilizes the system, there can be cases where from that stable political institutions emerge. The final kind of oligarchy, which is I think the one we're most concerned about, is Winters calls it a civil oligarchy. Right? This is where the oligarchs, there's no political institution for them. There's no Council of 10 like in Florence. And in fact, most of the oligarchs, as oligarchs, they don't actually hold any political offices. So that's why it's called civil, right? But from outside of the political offices, they can use wealth. They can use their wealth, for the most part, to basically determine outcomes in the political system. Right? So and obviously this kind of oligarchy would be more subtle. Now, Winters argues that in the ancient world, the Athenian Empire and the Roman Empire, that they were essentially oligarchies. And they were oligarchies that had some democratic institutions, but in the case of for example, the Roman Empire, that it was essentially the oligarchic families were the only ones that had access to these institutions. It would be an exception that a non-oligarchic family would gain access to these institutions. And in fact, part of the development of the Roman Empire from a republic to an empire is the emergence of one oligarch, right? One family, the family of Julius Caesar and his descendants, that gain a kind of dominance over the other oligarchs within the system. And so I think Winters' book is helpful for understanding that so much of the misinformation that we're subject to, whether it's in no matter what area of life you see it, right? That so oftentimes it's coming from these institutions, which are civil institutions, but these institutions such as Facebook, Instagram, and you could expand beyond social media institutions, but since this discussion today is about social media institutions, we'll limit it to that. But it's, so much of the concerns in our own time, right? As the church says, democracy is the preferred form of government. Well, so much of the concerns in our own time seem to be that, well, there are these institutions which are very powerful, which in some cases have more wealth than governments themselves. And these institutions can use, right, governments as a way of controlling the people, right? In other words, preventing democracy really from happening.
Well, it's
And
funny because you had. I mean, I think we've established now. I mean, especially for people who've just caught on to the second part and they haven't seen the first one, because in the first one you mentioned the Robert Kennedy, going into this, getting past his first round here, so to say, of this battle of bringing these guys to court because there's evidence that they're literally kind of rewiring little kids' brains. But I mean, I was recently listening to a conversation with a man, and he had cancer, and part of his cancer, after he'd overcome it, and he's recovered, he just doesn't sleep well at night, so he just kind of dedicates his time to watch the news. But I wish I could have recorded the conversation because it was just one thing after another. I'd never met the man in my life, so it's just the typical starters conversation. I think it was the weather. It was a really nice day the other day here. It was sunny, and then from there talking about how the Sahara Desert's creeping in more and more. So then we got into global warming, and then from global warming, a sickness that we recently had about 4 years ago, and how that sickness wasn't as serious, at the end as people thought it was. But we are starting to see that sickness is kind of leaving, heart conditions in people, and they're dying suddenly. And then from there to, how Putin's coming in as well. He's taking over basically the world. There's too many people in the world as it is. And it was one thing after another. And the whole time I was just thinking, I honestly thought, it seems like somehow they've kind of gotten in there and they've put ideas into someone's head, and he's kind of just regurgitating ideas. It's like this. I was having a surreal moment there. He seemed like such a nice guy, he's just middle class, hardworking guy, his van, his dog. It looked like this typical guy you would kind of think maybe wouldn't be so tuned in or tuned out. I don't know how you want to say it. But so this is kind of all this push of a propaganda, Father Jeff. You're talking about how, the oligarchy has it in their interest to keep the people with them, and have kind of a common thing there. It seems like everybody does have almost the same kind of ideas.
Yeah.
You mentioned empire, so we're not. It wouldn't be. It's the worst, I would say. No, as you said, it's not a democracy, but it's an oligarchy with a guise or a facade of a democracy, which is even worse because people are thinking, oh yeah, we're in a democracy. We're in a country now in Ireland. It was really reduced to about 13 men who are going to be pushing a referendum on 2 amendments on the Constitution.
Right.
And they bypassed this kind of pre-clearance stage that in 2016 and 2020, somehow they managed to get that out. So you don't have to have this pre-clearance phase anymore, and it's really just up to them. And so they got it through. They wouldn't have gotten it through otherwise. There's a lot of senators here, they call them TDs, that they wouldn't have really let this get through. But anyways, It's basically we're just going to be taking mother out of the Constitution and marriage as well. So family, mother, that's kind of limited.
Yeah.
It leaves people unsafe and outside. They're not protected anymore. So we have to kind of take those realities out. But anyways, just kind of moving on. So that's all established there. That we're kind of, we've established it that's kind of there. What are we looking at then? So as far as, the world we're living in right now, I mean, is this, how do you find, where are we at? What is this, the propaganda? And we mentioned a nihilistic empire. I thought that was interesting as well. Would you say that we're in a nihilistic empire that's basically just pushing for people to be propaganda?
Yeah, that article is, there's this French political philosopher, Emmanuel Todd, and the book hasn't come out in English yet, but he's just written a book on how the West is basically, he's saying the West is dissolving, right? The identity of in many Western European countries and in the United States is dissolving. It's dissolving because he says that, if you look at, and I think this is kind of a general you could just make this general observation that, so after the Second World War, right, the United States and in Europe, you had these individuals who were, think of Adenauer in Europe, de Gaulle. I'm sure there's others we could point to. In the United States, you had, Truman, Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy. Right? You have these leaders, and it's not that these leaders, again, we're not saying these leaders were perfect men. We're not saying that they embodied all of the wonderful qualities of the saints, right? But I think the point is that these leaders kind of had the word that Todd uses, and Todd himself I don't think he's a very religious man, but he said these leaders all had a kind of a Christian ethos, right? And he uses the word Protestant. They had a Protestant ethos, right? And with that Protestant ethos, there were certain good qualities that they brought to, world affairs. They brought a respect for justice, the desire to, there's a rule of law, that the rule of law is healthy for nations, right? Certain ideas of transparency, certain ideas of democratic participation, that it be available for all, right? And so Todd, in his book, I haven't read the whole book yet. I've started to read it, but he's basically saying that, this identity has dissolved, right? And in the face, as this identity dissolves, you see an empire developing, right? And why? Because, if you go back to the ancient world, if you go back to the dilemma between the Sophists on the one hand and Socrates on the other hand, without justice, without truth, without a commitment to, I guess now we would say, democratic participation, things like this, what's gonna develop is a kind of manipulation of perceptions, which is a kind of nihilism. And so that's what Emmanuel Todd is pointing towards in his book. And again, if you look at the currents in the history of philosophy the last 200 years, you see that there's a lot of philosophizing about how to dissolve institutions that are based in the Socratic pursuit for the truth, or in the Christian pursuit of love of the Blessed Virgin Mary as the model of all institutions. A friend of mine just wrote an article about in Mary's fiat at the Annunciation. That's the basic principle of all Western law, right? That's pretty good, if we can flesh that one out. But you can see that there's a lot of intellectual activity in the last 200 or 300 years. Some philosophers explicitly understand themselves to be engaging in a destruction of institutions that they think were built on either the Socratic desire for the truth, or the Christian, the Christ-like desire for the good and the truth and the beautiful and unity and love as the model of human relationships, true love as the model of human relationships. So it's not a surprise that if those institutions dissolve, if the rationale for them fades away, that what you're going to be left with is institutions in which individuals are seeking money, power, and the problem of truth being the opinion of the powerful. And I think that there is a kind of, this is where the internet also offers a counterbalance, right? There's an interesting counterbalance, and maybe we're just in a moment, right? Maybe we're just in a moment and it'll be closed off, but that might not be the case either, right? And I think this is where the Canadian bishops, what they're pointing towards, and maybe we in our own experience are seeing it, that there still is a kind of freedom that's available on the internet for people to pursue the truth and to come to a knowledge of the truth and how to be saved. and and so again, there's some facts, there's just some things we point at, it's kind of interesting just as some data points here, right? That 40 million people listen to Joe Rogan every week. 30 million people listen to Alex Jones every week. I mean, I'm just naming some alternative commentators. Tucker Carlson he's done interviews that have gotten 20 million views. This most recent interview with the president of Russia, President Putin, it's so far gotten over 1 billion views. Right? I don't know if you can say that's happened before.
That was a question I had for you, Father Jeff.
I know this is another silly example, but the Super Bowl, our football final this year, right? It got 200 million unique views across all platforms. Go ahead.
Sorry, that was my question, because there was a documentary that was going around schools a couple years ago. It was called The Social Dilemma, and I kind of had a bit of a flag go off because it was Netflix. And I didn't think anything good was going to be coming from Netflix, really. I still don't. But I was kind of, after I watched it, they were making a lot of good points, a lot of the mental health issue points, and a lot of these big top guys in Silicon Valley wouldn't let their kids use the products that they themselves are kind of engineering. It was kind of a telltale sign that. But, you had head guys there from Twitter and Apple, Google, and they're kind of out in the documentary just, really saying that it's kind of gotten out of hand, technology. And it was almost like I thought that the conclusion they were getting is that we have to kind of get off of it. But then I started thinking, I'm like, I don't know. It's like, it could be completely wrong. This could have been brilliant and good. But I just started thinking afterwards, is this getting out of hand, out of control? Because it is a great tool to kind of keep people at bay and, kind of control them and always, have them kind of hooked. But then again, you can be getting these platforms that are a bit independent or whatnot, and like a different platform than, the mainstream. At some point,
Right.
is that going to be getting out of their hand, or are they going to be losing a bit of control there with it?
Well, this is where, I think the bishops are pointing towards this, and there's others that are discovering this as well. If we start to form ourselves to understand what is the mechanism that we're using, what is the instrument that we have, and if we start to form ourselves to use it well, then all of these negatives, you might say, could be overcome. Right? So there's this. I sent around these books. There's this father, and again, I don't think this particular father has any particular religious motivation, but he started a press because he started to think to himself, well, the internet's a reality, and there's nothing I can do about it. But as far as I'm just a dad trying to raise my kids, but what I can do is I can teach my kids I can give my kids the criteria or the skills that they need in order to effectively engage in using the internet as a tool to get to the truth. So they started a press, and they started to make books that they thought were age appropriate for introducing or helping children, or high schoolers, college students, to acquire the skills that they need to effectively engage in the internet as far as getting to the truth. And obviously the Canadian bishops, what they emphasize is engaging in respectful dialogue with charity, right? Charity towards all. And we should all do that. And so this press is called the Tuttle Twins Press. And they have one book that's just on logical fallacies. If you can find a logical fallacy, well, there might be many reasons why there's a logical fallacy. One reason could just be, well, the mind is limited, right? We can all make mistakes. Well, other people could be using logical fallacies because they want to mislead, right? One of the effects of a logical fallacy, independent of anyone's intentions, is that it could mislead you from acquiring the truth. So, like it's a book like this. If you want to engage in the internet and acquire the truth, well, learn what logical fallacies are, so you can identify them. So you can identify when someone might be trying to mislead you or get you upset, right? Get you angry in some one way or the other. Then they wrote this other book, Beware of Your Own Bias. And I think there's something to that as well, right? We all have ideas or opinions that we haven't thought through. We haven't thought through in any kind of a critical way. And actually, I think one of the dangers of the internet is that people will say, well, I follow so and so, and I follow I follow X, I follow Y, I follow Z. And I think the response to that is, well, I don't follow anybody. I'm a critical thinker, right? In other words, the individuals that whatever I listen to, right? Whatever I listen to, or whoever I listen to, it's because, well, this person offers evidence, maybe that others are not offering. And as with all evidence, I have to start to evaluate the evidence to say, well, is this evidence valid or not? Is it verifiable or not? And including my own opinions, right? And so that's where I think this book is also helpful. The other one they came up with was, I forget the title now, but it has to do with recognizing conspiracy theories.
That's it, yeah.
Right? And I think that's what they do in that book, which I think is also very interesting, is that true conspiracies, yeah. They basically go through a series of events in the 20th century where you take the event, and at the beginning of the event, it was almost universally accepted as X happened. And with study and research and whatnot, by 20 years later, what comes out is the opposite of X happened, right? The negative X happened. And I think what this book points us towards, and actually they specifically chose, some things are not, some of the events that they chose, maybe now we wouldn't say, oh, super important, but they specifically chose events where eventually somebody doing the research and putting forth the evidence was able to definitively refute what was initially reported in the large newspapers as like the absolute truth that we all must follow. And so, but I think what this book also points us towards, something that the Canadian bishops point out, and I think something that we see in our own experience, is that there's nothing like real relationships. And I think one of the real relationships that we have is, and we have to use our critical capacity also in these real relationships, but our relationship with books, right? With people who have taken a topic and who have done extensive research into this topic, weighing the evidence, trying to tell us, well, what is true and what is false? What can be verified? What cannot be verified? Are there questions here that nobody seems to be answering? Are there holes in the argument? And that's where I think the Tuttle Twins say, well, this is where a lot of times the people who start out and everybody calls them conspiracy theorists, well, really, what are they? They're people that are genuinely, some of them at least, are genuinely good critical thinkers because they notice holes in the argument that nobody else seems to be going after, or they notice that something's not, that there's no evidence, there's no way of verifying what's being claimed in a given narrative of whatever it might be. And so that's where I think that when we can step back from the internet and acquire some of these critical skills, then we can engage in dialogue on the internet, or we can engage in dialogue anywhere that is actually helpful for, again, acquiring the truth, coming to a knowledge of what's just and unjust in our given circumstances.
Well, it's out there. It's a continent, as Benedict XVI called it. It's a whole new continent that has to be evangelized, explored, and like any other mission, it has its dangers and it has its traps. But I believe that this is the way. And I think an ally that we do have is that people are slowly, thanks be to God, they're kind of waking up and they're saying, wait a second, especially with this world of like, images and then articles, and they start feeling like they're moved towards anger, they're
Yeah.
moved to go towards something to start. I think what I've seen is that hopefully, people are kind of starting to take a step back and say, hold on, wait a second. I think they're playing on my passion of or compassion or anger or,
Yeah.
and I'm getting all riled up. So it's good to know that I think some people are kind of starting to do that. People who are listening as well to this, you guys check out those books as well for your adolescence as well, because that's a very sad thing when a young person loses his capacity for critical thinking. It's so sad because that's the age of going out there and starting to establish, and it's a beautiful thing with the youth, but it's so sad to kind of see you just get like groups of, not everybody, you do get groups kind of just like these zombies, or just they've fallen into like, oh, that's your truth and that's great for you, I feel happy, and or even ones that are worse that just they kind of swallow everything. But I'm glad you put those names out there, Father Jeff. Throughout the whole program, really, you kind of been going back and hopefully waking up an interest in people to read the classics, and that to see that these dynamics were going on with, in the times of Plato, and how it's just really, these things don't change. And like you said, over time and space as well, you can kind of see it playing out in different places. But maybe we can end now with taking some advice there from one of the points that the bishops, the Canadian bishops, they offered a technological sabbatical. If it's just a day, just to divorce your phone for a day, leave it there, the screen, especially here in Lent. That could be kind of like an alms or a way of fasting, just to kind of gear up the prayer life. Because at the end of the day, if we are getting lost in all of this and we're getting swamped, which so many people have said it as well, I think the average they said globally was 6 years of your life you're going to have spent on the phone, just going off of the average daily user. And it's more amongst the youth. And I think it's 3 years of your life you spend eating and sleeping, or just eating maybe. But anyways, it's kind of something to think about, to get the prayer life vamped up, especially in this time of Lent, and to pray for us. We might have been sniped there by one of those drones there. It's just something, we're just trying to, speak the truth here. I don't think there's anything that controversial, really just saying what's there. But thank you so much, Father Jeff, and hopefully, please God, we'll continue the conversation. If there's something else that comes up, pray for Father Jeff, you guys, and his ministry and his apostolate, and maybe you can leave us with your blessing, Father, and we'll hopefully have you on in some future.
Good. May the Lord be in your heart and on your lips, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right. Thanks, Father Jeff, and God bless you guys. See you next Monday.